Welcome and good afternoon. We would like to get started with our K-State Garden Hour series. Thank you for joining us today. This series is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Krista Harding and I am the horticulture agent for the Southwind Extension District. Before we get started, just a couple of friendly reminders, housekeeping notes. You may have noticed that you are unable to mute your mic. We will keep your mics muted throughout this presentation, and this will help eliminate any background noise. As you know, we have a lot of participants today, and we want to ensure that everyone has the best experience possible. So with that being said, please keep your video turned off. Now that we've covered those details, we can jump into the real reason you attended today. This webinar series has allowed us to continue to provide extension education related to horticulture and gardening, given the circumstances we are in today. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional. For K-State, most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline. But most of all, we each have a love for gardening and the natural environment. Each week, we have been featuring a new topic related to gardening and horticulture, and our goal is to meet the needs of new gardeners as well as seasoned gardeners alike. We have a moderator today. Our moderator is Travis Carmichael. He is the horticulture agent in Lyon County. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please send them to the Q&A box that you will find at the bottom of your screen. Travis will be keeping track of these questions throughout the presentation as they come in, and we will have an optional Q&A session at the end of our speaker's presentation. We will do our best to get through all of the questions, but in the event we do not answer them all, we will be uploading additional resources for you on our Horticulture and Natural Resources website. This will serve as a great reference after the presentation. You will also be able to access today's presentation on this website. Today's webinar will be recorded and we will post it to the website as previously mentioned. You can also find other topics from previous presentations on that site as well. The events in the, you can stay tuned in to what's going on within our department as well as stay up to date on upcoming topics within this series. Be sure that you like, share, and use the K-State Garden Hour hashtag to help promote us and this program. So I'm excited today to talk about hydrangeas. How about we get started? Hydrangeas for the Garden is going to be presented by Dennis Patton, Johnson County Horticulture Extension Agent. Dennis, we will turn it over to you. Please give us a few minutes to transition to get his presentation up.
Well, Krista, I think I jumped the gun and already put my presentation up, so I think we may be ready to jump right into this. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the presentation. Just a little background on myself. I am the Johnson County Horticulture Agent, but I grew up south of Wichita and been here in the Kansas City area for a while. And I see that we have about 20% of our people have not grown hydrangeas before and the rest have. So hopefully we'll turn those that have not had hydrangea experience onto the joy of growing them, and those that have grown them, hopefully to greater success. I learned a lot about hydrangeas working with our extension master gardeners in our demonstration gardens here in Johnson County. In fact, our garden located here at our office in Olathe has about 15 to 20 different varieties and species of hydrangeas. So I've got to experiment kind of firsthand with growing hydrangeas. So let's see if I get my slides advance here. So, you know, hydrangea is that plant that conjures up all sorts of images. You know, it's always featured in garden magazines as being that wonderful plant. You see it in artwork. You see it very commonly in home decor. It's kind of that symbol of, you know, kind of Southern hospitality. And I think there's few plants, especially when you look at the big blue flower here, that has such an allure or draw or attraction of hydrangeas. And we're lucky in Kansas that we can grow a lot of different species of hydrangeas. Some we can grow a lot easier than others. And we're going to kind of explore that today in this presentation. So if you look at kind of hydrangeas themselves, what I think is interesting is that there are a couple species that are native to parts of the United States. A lot of the ones we grow, like the macrophylla, we'll talk about the different species in a second, more Asia, China countries. There's the South American ones, but if you look down there, we can grow both the arborescens and the corsifolia, which that's the Annabelle smooth types or the oak leaf hydrangea. So those are native to the United States, which I think found that very interesting. If you had to kind of put all the hydrangeas into one big, quick, easy overall general description, they're flowering shrubs. That's why we grow them. Some of them can be trained into small trees. There also are climbing vines. And if you look at overall at these hydrangeas, they're going to prefer moist soil, warmer temperatures, and light shading. And we'll get into each of these a little bit more detail when we talk about each of the general species. But the word hydra and hydrangea means water for a reason. So they do, depending on the species, like a little bit more evenly moist. And there are a large number of these species. You know, we think about them all being deciduous in the Kansas City and the Kansas climate, but there are evergreen species. Now, none of those are hardy here in our climate, but this list here are the species that we can grow throughout the Kansas area and have quite a bit of success with them, depending on their culture and their care. So as we continue kind of on this background information, you know, flowers are why we grow the hydrangea. And so the inflorescence or the flower head is made up of many small florets. They're a combination of a whole bunch of little small blooms. And there we have the rounded or flat top corms. And then we also have what we call the panicle type bloom, which is more that cone shape as opposed to the flat rounded type bloom. And then those inflorescences are made of two different types of flowers within those. There's true fertile flowers, which are the small, tiny ones. I'll show a picture of them in just a second. These are grouped together in large numbers, sometimes in the center. They can be spread throughout. And what I think a lot of people find surprising is that a lot of these fertile flowers are wonderful sources of nectar. In fact, when some of these fertile flowers are in bloom in our garden, you'll see a number of different pollinators on these plants foraging for food. We don't usually think about hydrangeas being a pollinator-friendly plant, but depending on the species, it can be. And then we have what we call more the decorative types. These are the sterile flowers. These are the big, showy, conspicuous flowers that I think a lot of us are drawn to more so than the fertile flowers. And they can be distributed around the plant of the bloom or the panicle itself. And the sterile flowers, really their job is to attract the insects. The fertile flowers are then to provide the insects with the food supply. So here, if you look at the one on the left, the big white flowers, that would be the sterile flowers. And then those little tiny kind of bead heads, that would be the fertile flowers. And same here on the picture on the right, you see a lot more sterile, less fertile flowers. But they do have those combinations. So that's one type of inflorescence. And then we have the third shape that a lot of people gravitate to, and this is called the globosa. This is not a natural or forming inflorescence. Actually, this is a sport that happened out in nature. And this is what we see a lot of times in those macrophylla, big leaf hydrangeas, or the arborescens hydrangeas that people refer to as Annabelle hydrangeas a lot of times. And that's kind of that more classic bloom because it's all sterile flowers, very bold, very showy, and kind of has that allure of what a hydrangea is. We don't know, a lot of times appreciate those fertile flowers as much as we should. And as we kind of continued this discussion about flower heads, a lot of times people just refer to their hydrangeas as mop heads or lace caps, but that only really refers to the way the flower is formed. It doesn't tell you what species or variety of hydrangea you have. So when you think about that globose flower shape, lots of sterile flowers, that's what we call a mop head hydrangea. You think more something flat top, that corm that has marginal sterile flowers, more fertile flowers, then we refer to that as a lace cap hydrangea. And interesting enough, the macrophylla, the big showy one, can either be mop heads or lace cap flowering type plants. So this is just kind of definitions of the different types of flowers. And later on in the presentation, I'll show you a macrophylla hydrangea that's a mop head and one that's a lace cap. So they're not always mop heads, that big globose flower shape. And so here's kind of another just kind of image of that lace cap, the one on the left, the more blue, still blue showy, but you have the sterile flowers around the edge, fertile flowers in the center. So it's that lace cap type as opposed to that mop head, that big showy, all fertile flowers type hydrangea. And so a lot of times we get hung up on flower color about hydrangea, and we got to kind of separate flower color based on species of hydrangea. So we'll get into this in a little more detail later on. But in nature, most of the fertile flowers tend to be white. White is probably in nature the predominant color, but you can pick up some pinks, blues, lilacs. And then also the sterile flowers in nature tend to be predominantly white or cream. You can pick up some of those softer pastel shades though. But what has happened is that through cultivation, man has created these really rich, bold colors of pink and blue, especially in the macrophylla types. Man breeders are also trying to bring more of those pinks, especially into some of the other species of hydrangeas, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And we'll talk about changing flower color when we get to the macrophylla, because that's the only species that you can change flower color in, potentially based on soil pH, is the macrophylla types. So that's kind of a little background introduction to hydrangeas. So let's now get in more to the meat of the program. And what we're going to do is just take a quick look at each of the different species of hydrangeas we can grow in our Kansas gardens. So we look at the Hydrangea anamala, which is the climbing hydrangea. Arborescens, the common name is referred to as smooth hydrangea. Like I said, that's a lot of people call Annabelle, but that's a specific variety. We have the macrophylla hydrangeas, big leaf hydrangeas. That's the big globose pink, blue we're used to. We have the panicle hydrangeas or paniculatas. Limelight is a very common variety, just to kind of give you touch points. And then we can also grow the corsifolia, which is commonly called oak leaf hydrangea. So what we're going to do for the rest of the program is just kind of look at the ins and outs of each of these species. And we're going to kind of just move through this fairly fast because there's a lot of information. And I know we're generating a lot of questions. We'll try to get to those at the end, and hopefully I will answer a lot of those questions. So climbing hydrangea is a woody vine. It can reach up to 30 feet tall in good conditions. It flowers in June. It is one of those lace cap flower heads, so you get the sterile and fertile flower mix. Kind of brownish red is the bark of the wood of the hydrangea once it defoliates in the fall. It's hardy in zone 5. With many of these hydrangeas, one of the problems is a lot of people put hydrangeas in too much shade and then they don't bloom. So ideally, a lot of these would like morning sun and then some protection from hot afternoon, not really hot afternoon sun. Even moisture, like all these, tend to do best. And then one of the things we need to pay close attention to as we go through this presentation is this pruning. And this concept, I'll just go ahead and reiterate, this concept of blooms on old wood, blooms on new wood. So the concept of blooms on old wood is that during the summer months and then into fall, the plant sets a flower that overwinters, then following year, then that bloom develops. With blooms on new wood, in the spring, that growth comes out and it terminates in a flower bud later on in the summer. So this gets back into our pruning. So if it blooms on old wood, as a rule of thumb, we prune it after it blooms. If it blooms on new wood, we prune it in the spring before growth begins. My last comment on climbing hydrangea, it's a sucker, so it doesn't twine, so you have to have some sort of wall or something that it can cling to get it to go. My take on climbing hydrangeas in a lot of the Kansas climate is they're a wonderful vine, but we don't sometimes see as profuse flowering as we see in pictures and magazines. It tends to be a little bit more sparse. And part of that could be, as you're going to hear this mantra on a lot of these old blooming plants, are flower bud hardiness. Even though these plants are hardy to zone 5, zone 6, a lot of times when we have real rapid temperature change, the flower buds are not as winter hardy. So climbing hydrangea is a great vine, tends to be more of a green vine than really for its flower power. But it is a nice vine. And I'm going to move on. That's probably the one I'm going to say the least about because it's the one that probably has grown least in our area. So I'm going to start with the most difficult of all these to grow. And this is the Hydrangea macrophylla or macrophylla. This is that popular one that you see with the big pink blooms in our climate. It's the only one of all these that, dependent on soil pH and aluminum content, you can change the flower color from pink to blue. The native plant, as I said, is a lace cap, and those mop heads have been around for several hundred years, that big globose head. So as a rule of thumb, all these macrophylla, big leaf hydrangeas, are about a 4-foot shrub. They're winter hardy to zone 5-6, which covers the state of Kansas. But their native range is a more warm, temperate climate, and focus in on the words free from extremes. What tends to get us into problems with the macrophylla hydrangeas is that they do not tolerate early freezes or late spring freezes. And a lot of times they don't fully harden off, and then either the entire branch dies back or the flower bud is killed back with those extremes. So we'll touch on that a little bit more, but just kind of keep that in mind. There's over 1,000 varieties or cultivars of this big leaf macrophylla hydrangea on the market. And the bottom line is you could probably put them all in a bag, shake them up, and pretty much all of them are going to perform about the same. They have not really come up with one that stands head and shoulders, overcoming some of the temperature issues that we have with this plant. And so there's a lot of varieties out there in the market. Kind of general care, morning sun to light shade. A lot of people put this plant in shade because it wilts on the heat of the day because that big foliage loses a lot of moisture. So it can be well watered, but on a hot Kansas sunny day, it can still wilt. So it does need even moisture. It does need well-drained soil. And it would be best if we improved our clay soils a little bit so we have better drainage in them. But one of the mistakes people make is they do not give them enough sun. And when it comes to hydrangeas, more sun, better blooming, less sun, less blooming. And originally this plant basically bloomed on old wood. And actually, even with some of the repeat blooming ones we're going to talk about here in a second, still the best bloom is produced on that old wood. That's your spring bloom, not your summer bloom. And the problem they've not been able really to fix in breeding is the flower bud hardiness. So in the Kansas City area for the last 3-4 years, we've either had an early fall freeze or a late spring freeze, which has killed back the plant. And as a result, we've gotten little spring flowering. So pruning of this plant, since its best flowers are on old wood, is in the spring, just cut out winter-killed wood. Don't prune back into any healthy bud because that potentially could be your spring flower. If you do need to control size, you would prune it after it blooms. But what happened about 10 years ago is they got these repeat blooming remontant hydrangea macrophyllas on the market. A lot of people just call these endless summer hydrangeas, but that's a specific marketing group of plants, not necessarily the repeat blooming group. And so the goal was that because they could bloom on old and new wood, you would get blooms in the spring, you'd get blooms in the fall or late summer. But unfortunately, what's happened is the flower buds still winter kill. That's your best bloom. And then you get that late summer bloom, which under Kansas heat sometimes is not the best flowering bloom. So one of the big questions is, why didn't my macrophylla hydrangea bloom in the spring? Well, because the flower buds were winter killed. And there are ways, if you want to, you can try wrapping the plants, put them in microclimates to protect them a little bit more. And maybe as you move south, you may have less problems with the winter kill issue. But we still have extremes of weather, even in southern Kansas, when we get those rapid temperature change in spring and fall. That doesn't necessarily get us over this problem of winter bud hardiness. So when we come to this group of plants, then we get into the flower color change. So if we're above around 6.5, we have pink flowers because of the tie-up aluminum. Acidic soils, we get more of that blue flower, kind of borderline, as you can see in this picture. You get the pinkish and blue flowers mixed together. So, we always recommend start with a soil test so you know your baseline, but if it blooms pink, it's going to be alkaline, which most Kansas soils are. So the best way to make your hydrangeas bloom blue is to add sulfur to lower the soil pH based off your soil test. Never add lime if you want a blue hydrangea, because that's just going to increase it. The organic matter a lot of times will help pull that pH down in the soil too, but not always. And then kind of the catch is that a lot of people just say, well, if I want a blue hydrangea, add aluminum sulfate. Because what that does is add aluminum to the soil, saturates the soil with aluminum, so we get that blue flower. But I will caution you about excessive use of aluminum sulfate, as many other plants in our landscape can be toxic to high levels of aluminum. So the best way is to lower your soil pH and just then touch it up with the aluminum, but don't keep applying aluminum sulfate over and over and over to keep that blue color. So as I said earlier, there's countless varieties. Some bloom pink, some bloom blue, depending on the pH. There are some out there, but really not in our climate, that only bloom blue. There's some out there that only bloom pink. So if you want a blue hydrangea, be careful not to buy the pink only variety. As I said, they all perform about the same. And my take on this plant is it's not a plant it and forget it plant. If you're looking for a low maintenance plant, this is probably not the one for you. My recommendation, if you're going to grow the macrophyllus, put it in a location where you're going to give it lots of love because it's going to need even water. It's going to need some care to make it grow the best and perform the best for you in our climate. So I've already kind of talked about why no blooms. So I'm going to go over this slide really quick. It's basically deals with temperature change. So this lower left-hand picture is what most of the macrophylla hydrangeas looked like in the Kansas City area this year, because a year ago, back in September, we had a really hard freeze. So it killed the plant back to the ground. Thus, we had very few or no spring flowers. And the goal is that we will get some fall, late summer flowers because of that repeat blooming. So a lot of people call these just endless summer hydrangeas. This variety came on a few years ago, but keep in mind, endless summer is a marketing term, a collection of 5 different varieties of hydrangeas. Some of them are blue, some are pink, some are mophead, some of them are lace caps. We've already kind of talked about the whole culture and care. And I've got a picture here of Dr. Michael Durr here. He's kind of the guru that started this whole endless summer collection with these repeat blooming hydrangeas. And like I said, since the very first one, the original came out, Belmar, they've got some better varieties out there. But unfortunately, because it is a little finicky, a little touchy, it doesn't always flower dependably. A lot of people jokingly nicknamed this plant Endless Bummer instead of Endless Summer. So hopefully you enjoy that sense of humor here. There's really actually 5 plants in the Endless Summer collection. There's the original, there's Blushing Bride, that's only a white flowering one, so here again, be careful. There's one called Twist and Shout that is a lace cap, not a mophead. Bloomstruck, blue pink, and then Raspberry Crush came out and it's a deep pink, so it won't bloom blue no matter what you do. And there's a lot of others on there in the also. There's all these series out there, like the Let's Dance series, the City Line series, others. But the bottom line take-home message is pretty much no matter the variety, they're all going to pretty much need the same culture, care, and have the same rewards and also the same disappointments when it comes to variety selections. So let's move on. Well, one other quick thing. Now you're also seeing some mountain hydrangeas come on the market. A lot of times these are crossbred with the macrophylla. The theory here, these are supposed to be a little bit more durable and tough in our climate. And they also have the dependable flowers, but my take is the serrata hydrangeas are pretty much identical to the big leaf hydrangeas when it comes to their culture and care and their dependability on flowering. So let's turn to ones that I think we can have a lot more success with and a lot more enjoyment throughout the entire state of Kansas with some of these other species of hydrangeas. And the first one I want to talk about is arborescens or smooth hydrangea. This is one of those that's native to the United States, perfectly hardy to zone 4. It's a small erect shrub around 3 feet. And most of the flowers we see are that rounded mop head form. Like I said, this would be the Annabelle hydrangea, if that helps a lot of you understand which group we're talking about. Culture and care, full sun to light shade, even heavy shade. My take is more sun, more moisture to keep them happy. This is actually one of the more drought tolerant types of hydrangeas. Also, more sun gives you more sturdy stems, because one of the problems with this is they tend to flop when it rains, and more sun, sturdier stems. All plants like well-drained soil. But here's the take-home good news. This plant blooms on new wood, so we don't have to worry about that flower bud hardiness. Basically, you prune it when it starts to grow in the spring. And yeah, this line here is correct. You cut it to the ground. So on this picture here, you would just cut back to where those 3 buds are, remove all that old growth, even though it may start the leaf out, because each of those new shoots from the base is going to come up, terminate in a big, showy flower head. So this is my front yard in the Patton garden. So here on the left is what it looked like back probably in March. When I pruned it, you can see the daffodils just starting to come up. You can see when I'm done pruning that plant. And right now that plant is about 3 foot tall, covered with big white heads. So Annabelle is the classic, been around forever. You can actually find this in some old farmsteads and old homes around Kansas. Like I said, it can flop, so they're breeding for stronger stems. And it starts to flower probably late May through June, July. And then a lot of times these flower heads kind of go to a chartreuse green that holds for the rest of the summer. And then they brown out in the winter months. Credible is a newer variety that came out on the market. It has a little bit stronger stems. It's a little bit taller. And under good conditions, probably one of those flower heads can be the size of a volleyball. Very impressive, very big, very showy. I have mine pretty much in full sun. They've been doing great, especially with all the spring rains we've had this year. And now what's happened in this world is they've tried to bring, and they have brought pink tones into the arborescens hydrangeas. So the original ones were Invincible Spirit and Invincible Spirit 2. But one of the take-homes on this is these pictures were all taken in my garden home. So under warmer spring weathers, we kind of get more of this mauve color. Under cooler weather, we get more of that pink tones we're looking for. So it kind of varies from year to year. And now there's a few newer ones on the market, like this Mini Mauvette, Invincible Ruby. And in our demonstration garden here, these are a richer, bolder pink, and they tend to hold that color a little bit better. And another little fun one is this Wee White that's only probably about 18 inches to 2 foot at most. So to me, these plants work really great in a perennial garden as well into our landscape. And there's a lot other varieties on the market. More and more of these keep coming out all the time. So let's now switch to the panicle hydrangea or Hydrangea paniculata. These are larger shrubs, and they can actually be pruned into small trees in their native habitat. They're open to woodlands. Very adaptable, hardy to zone 3. Most of them form this panicle cone-shaped flower. You can find them with a lot of white fertile flowers and also with a lot of sterile flowers. And what they're trying to do is breed more and more of these pinkish undertones into this plant, so we have a little bit more color than just the traditional white. Culture and care, full sun to light shade, more sun, more flowers, bigger flowers, even moisture, better flowering. On drier sites, you're going to have smaller flowers, plants can be less vigorous. Well-drained soils, and here again, this plant blooms on new growth, so you would prune it in the early spring before growth begins. The older variety that was on the market, it was one called PG. It was oftentimes sold as a small tree or a shrub. One of the problems with this old variety is it's very heavy. These inflorescence droop, and a lot of people don't like the flopping nature. So they're trying to breed stronger stem strength to keep them upright. And probably when this plant became back in vogue a few years ago was because of the variety Limelight being released on the market. It had much stronger stems. If left unpruned, this plant can get 6 feet or more tall and wide. And one of the things I've noticed on this plant, the less you prune it, you get smaller flowers. So in this picture here in our demonstration garden, in a good year, those flowers are probably the size of a football. If you leave it unpruned, you get more maybe baseball, softball sized heads, but you get more of them. So if you want big showy heads, we actually prune our Limelight back to about 18 inches, 2 foot every spring. And then every shoot, new growth that comes up terminates in that big head. I've seen where people don't prune them back and they become these 6x6 shrubs. And personally, for me, they look kind of overgrown, kind of gnarly. They don't maybe have as pretty shape, but you do get nice summer blooms. And the paniculata hydrangeas are just now starting to come into flower. So, you know, we have the Annabelle types back in May, June, and then we get a lot of these coming into flower in July and August, which is really great for giving us some nice summer color. There's also some dwarf varieties out there. There's one called Little Lime that maybe stays around 3 feet. Another old-fashioned one is one called Tardiva. And if you look closely there, you can see this one has more of a mix of fertile and sterile flowers. And in our demonstration garden, this is the one where you see a lot of the native pollinators, the bees, the wasps, out there working over those fertile flowers. And they tend to hold their color really well into later into the summer or into the fall with that whitish color before they brown out going into winter. Little Lamb is another compact form. It tends to flop a little bit less than Little Lime, but here again, around 3 foot. This is in our demonstration garden just now. Actually, I just took that picture last week of it into flower. And probably my favorite, if I had to pick one of the panicle hydrangeas I would plant in my yard, I would use the variety Quickfire. There you can see it in tree form in the upper right. It's in our demonstration garden. I took that picture here again about a week ago. And there you see the shrub form of it. But the thing I like about Quickfire is it blooms about a month ahead of the other ones. So where most of them don't start blooming till late July, Quickfire probably starts blooming in late June. And then there's also a variety called Little Quickfire that's about 3 to 5 as opposed to regular Quickfire, maybe 5 to 6. But here again, in our demonstration gardens, we prune them back probably to 18 inches, 2 foot to keep more compact plants, bigger, showier blooms. And then there's a lot of other ones out there on the market too. They're trying to get more dwarf ones. So there's one called Bobo, Bombshell, that tops out about 2 to 3 feet. And their other goal is to get more pink undertones into these, like Vanilla Strawberry, Pinky Winky. So here you can see some other new ones on the market, Lava Lamp, Candelabra, Firelight. So in our climate, I've never seen one quite that pink, but under cooler summer conditions, so this would not be the summer, you will see more pink undertones develop. I had the Vanilla Strawberry in my own garden at home, and a couple years ago when we had a cool July, I did see that pink right off the bat, but in these 90-degree weathers, it's probably gonna be white, and then as the white starts to fade, hopefully some of those pink undertones will start to develop. I think as breeding goes on, we're gonna get better and better about seeing more of these pink colors, because that's kind of, I think, one of the knocks on some of these more durable hardy hydrangeas for Kansas is that we're pretty much limited to white, and people want those rich blues and rich pinks, which are just harder to get. The good news is they're very adaptable, easy to grow, because they do bloom on that new wood. So the last group of hydrangeas I want to talk, and I'm sorry, I know I've been running through this really fast, but I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions at the end because I know this topic generates questions, is the Hydrangea quercifolia, or what we call the oak leaf hydrangea. This one, it does have a lobe leaf, so its leaf is completely different. And as we go through some of the varieties here in a second, you'll see that leaf pattern's a little bit different, but this is another one of those that is native to Southeast United States. Very hardy throughout Kansas, hardy to zone 5. It's a deciduous shrub. Some of the varieties can get really tall, 7, 8 feet or more. The flowers have these long panicles, and you can see it's a mixture of the fertile and the sterile flowers. It also has a very interesting exfoliating bark. As we will drop its leaves in the fall, you will see kind of the cinnamon brown bark start to appear. And then a lot of these varieties have really excellent, great fall color. You know, we always say, oh, give me a plant that's got 4 seasons. Ooh, I want 4 seasons. I want year-round interest. And really, there's very few plants that give us that year-round interest. But one that I would put at the top of this list would be the oak leaf hydrangeas. They're in flower now. So here again, they start flowering in June. Then those flowers kind of go chartreuse the rest of the summer. They start to brown out in the fall. Then in the fall months, you get the wonderful, rich purple, burgundy, red fall colors. And then in the winter months, you get the exfoliating bark and structure of the plant. And then it leaves back out the following year. So like I said, to me, this is one of the few plants that really does give you something visually different throughout every season in the Kansas area. So morning sun to light afternoon shade. We've got some in our demonstration garden in full sun, and they're doing great, but we have to watch the watering. This is one of the few hydrangeas that I think still blooms pretty well with more heavy shade. In my own garden, I've got one under a large hackberry tree, and it's blooming its heart out right now. But here again, most of them prefer not to have that grueling afternoon sun. Even moisture would be best, but this one will tolerate a mild drought. I would put it fairly drought tolerant. Now, would I let it go through a complete Kansas summer without any supplemental moisture? Probably not, but it can get by on a little bit less. And here again, it blooms on old wood. So it's one of those you don't have to worry about the flower buds being winter hardy. So you would prune it after it flowers. In the spring, you take off the dead wood like any plant, let it flower. And then if you need to control size, shape, habit, you would prune it after it blooms. But the problem is it never really goes away having a nice bloom. So you've got to prune it when you still have nice blooms to give it time to set its blooms for next year. So my goal on this plant is pick the right variety for the right location and do as little pruning as possible to get all its attributes that you would want from this plant. So kind of looking at a few varieties here. Alice has been around for a while. It's probably one of the biggest one. It can get maybe up to 10 feet. This picture here is taken in our demonstration garden here in Olathe. Here again, just a couple weeks ago. So that plant is a good 6 feet or more. And then it will turn a nice rich burgundy fall color. Snow Queen is a little bit smaller, also taken in our demonstration garden just a couple weeks ago, maybe 4 to 6 feet. And some of these panicle flowers can be a foot long. I mean, they are just extremely showy. And here again, more sun tolerant. Here again, you get back into those red bronze fall colors of those plants. And then I think that fits better in a lot of gardens are some of these smaller varieties. Here's one called Peewee, more around 3 to 4 foot. So you can see that here again a couple weeks ago in flower. And then in the lower left-hand picture is that same plant with its fall color. And so this one tends to go more that wine red fall color. So we're keeping those burgundy, those reds, which are really fall colors, I think, through the state of Kansas that a lot of us want. You know, we get a lot of yellow in Kansas, so we're really looking for some of the other rich shades. Ruby Slippers is a newer variety that came out, and it's one of those that probably does tend to go a little bit more pink. Unfortunately, this picture is not one in our garden here. We do have Ruby Slippers, and it has developed that soft pink undertone after it had that pink of white blooms. And it's a much smaller, nice, rounded, compact habit. So like I said, on these plants that get quite large, you really need to look at your location and pick the one that's going to fit, because you really don't want to prune more than you have to, because then you lose that bark. And here again, you still have to prune that plant when it's kind of top notch. You know, it's still looking great to make sure you get the following bloom. And I haven't really said how late you can prune, but my best guess would tell you probably don't prune it much later than after the 4th of July, mid-July. So here again, that plant has time to set new growth in the fall, set that bud for your spring of the next year. And there's a number of different varieties of these oak leaf hydrangeas on the market. You know, all these have, you know, varying different attributes to them. You know, Vaughan Lily is supposed to be a really full, big head. Snowflake's supposed to be a double flowering variety. Munchkin's touted to be really small, fits in a lot of areas. So you kind of see here kind of those other attributes showing up. So you see the fall color starting to develop. You see the flower head, and then after it's past bloom, it just goes to a nice rusty brown, which personally I like to leave those out there all winter long for winter interest, and then I snip those heads off when new growth begins in the spring. And probably the latest, greatest is this series that came out from Proven Winners a year or so ago, this Gatsby series, which is touted to have really big flower heads. One of my disappointments in this group of plants is they're all quite large, 6 feet or more. And I think as a lot of gardeners, we're looking more for these smaller, compact varieties. Because like I said, on these hydrangeas, to me, they make wonderful landscape plants, you know, in your shrub border, your foundation planting. But where I've really worked a lot of hydrangeas into my own personal garden, into our demonstration garden here, is I treat them like a perennial. For that year-round interest, that year-round color. It's one of the few plants, like I said, that will really shine during the summer months because, you know, when you start flowers with the Annabelle arborescens type back in late May or early June, and then the paniculata types come on in July, August, and last into fall. So I think they really provide us with a punch of flower color, you know, after that spring flush is gone. So I'm going to stop there, and I think Travis, you're my moderator to help me with Q&A, or Krista. I will be glad to answer questions now.
All right. Yes, Dan. Oh.
Thank you, Dennis. That was great. That information you shared from what you've seen in your personal gardens and your demonstrations gardens was excellent. I do know that we have some questions to get to. So Travis, I will turn it over to you to moderate those.
Yes, we got several. So I did, as I'm getting back to the top of the questions, and we'll remind everyone they can still submit questions if you would do that in the Q&A box. We'll get to them as we go. Let's see. We had a couple, Dennis, if you want to kind of clarify about the pruning with blooming on old wood and new wood. You want to maybe touch on that just a little bit again.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. You know, Travis, I went through that information so fast. You know, when I usually do a pruning talk, that's a 15-minute discussion. I did it in 30 seconds. So when it comes to any shrubs, just not our hydrangeas, they set flower buds 2 different ways, old wood or new wood. And so with an old wood blooming plant, usually these bloom more in the spring months. So the flower bud is set before the plant goes dormant in the fall for the following year. So on that grouping of plants, we prune them after they bloom. A lilac forsythia would be in that same group of plants. So if we prune those late winter, we're going to be cutting our flower buds off. So the one group of plants that we deal with on hydrangeas are the macrophyllus, our best old wood blooming, and oak leaf hydrangeas are old wood blooming. So we only want to snip off dead growth in the late winter, early spring. Do the bulk of the pruning after they flower. If they bloom on new wood, we want to prune those before they start really actively growing in the spring, or just start to grow late winter, early spring, because where we make that cut, a new shoot branch is going to come out, and then that's going to terminate in a flower bud. Summer flowering, new wood flowering plants tend to flower later into the year, June, July, August, as opposed to April, May. So this is the basis. We built all our pruning off on flowering shrubs based on old wood or new wood. Before flower or after flower is another way to look at it.
All right. Then we have several questions that ask about, are there certain varieties that are deer resistant?
You know, our demonstration garden here at the office has some mild deer pressure, and I've not seen a lot of deer damage on any of the hydrangeas. They did do a little nipping early on the arborescence type hydrangeas, but I've never really seen them bother the oak leaf type hydrangeas. And honestly, in the spring, we have more of the deer issues. Most of our macrophyllus die to the ground and they don't have a lot of growth to nibble on. As a rule of thumb, I would not put them in as a high risk category for deer, but I think that also depends on the amount of pressure you have from deer in your neighborhood.
All right. So someone has had an endless summer for about 5 years now, and it finally bloomed for the first time, but the bloom was very small. Plant seems to be fairly healthy. Any suggestions?
So kind of a personal story. I use that term endless bummer in one of the news releases I did up here. And I got a call from the breeder that produces endless summer hydrangea. And they gave me these tips: more sun, more water, and fertilize heavily. And the reason behind that, to get a big bloom, it takes a big, strong shoot. You have a weak shoot, small flower. So their recommendation was more sun, fertilize at the start of growth in the spring, and then maybe again in summer. And then here again, the biggest problem with those endless summer hydrangeas is, even though they're repeat blooming varieties, spring bloom, late summer bloom, our best bloom still comes on the old wood bloom, which is your biggest, strongest bloom. That's the one that's most likely to be damaged by winter temperatures. Unfortunately, in Kansas, where we have hot summers, the summer fall bloom tends to develop under more stressful conditions, which unfortunately gives you a smaller bloom. Hence why some people jokingly refer to them as endless bummer, because it's very difficult sometimes to get that bloom you see in magazines in Kansas. It's going to take some work and luck to make it happen. I don't mean to sound negative on the plant, but one of those plants I said in my presentation, you've got to love it to really get it to do its best.
All right. What is a best way to keep the flowers looking good once they've been cut, if you're using them for cut flower arrangements?
Yeah, one thing I like to do is kind of smash the stems a little bit, so you open up more area for them to absorb moisture or water. That's a trick with lilac and a few other woody shrubs, is to make sure then you do a fresh cut and put them into water. Definitely, pick up some packets of the Floral Life Extender, and that tends to help. So that'd be my recommendation, is just slightly take a pair of pliers or hammer and just smash that stem, maybe the lower inch and a half of it, to help up with water uptake. And then if they do start to wilt, you could immerse the entire flower head under water for a few minutes to kind of rehydrate it, and then dry it off and put it back into the arrangement. And then recut the stem from time to time if necessary.
Okay. This is on a kind of back to some pruning questions as well. Regarding the paniculata spring pruning, what month would be the best time?
I think anywhere kind of late March, April, depending on what part of the state you're in. Personally, I like to prune them just as the buds are starting to pop. And I like to then go back and find the really nice, fat, plump buds. Because here again, I know that the bigger the bud, the bigger the branch, the bigger the bloom. And I'm going for that really showy blooms. And so that's when I would do it, just when they start the pop. You could do it earlier if you want to, because these are very winter hardy. You know, I don't think a late spring freeze would harm them. So I would just wait for them to start to grow and then prune them back. And here again, if you don't want to keep them as small and bigger blooms, you can let them get larger plants. It depends on what you want to do, because it's one of those plants you can manage it to kind of fit what you want. But even when we prune some of those plants back to maybe 18 inches, a foot, in my own personal yard, my quick fire, it's probably 4.5 to 5 feet tall. And that plant was probably, when I was done pruning it, it was probably 12 to 18 inches at most. And because of our really robust rains we had this year, it's like I said, 4 to 5 feet tall and blooming.
And then we had a couple questions here come in on best places to purchase hydrangeas or plants, and then if local nurseries, garden centers may not be carrying your suggestions.
So unfortunately, the garden centers, at least what I see, and even when I get out to other parts of the state, are flooded a lot of times with the macrophylla hydrangeas, which I think are the ones we should be planting with more caution in our climate. Here again, the paniculatas, the oak leaves, the Annabelle tends to be available, but some of these newer varieties may be more difficult to find. So I think it's one of those things you just got to keep asking your nurseryman for or check. And then, of course, I'm not opposed to mail order. When you go to mail order on these plants, you're probably going to get a much smaller plant, maybe a quart size, gallon at most. So you're not going to get the biggest plant, but all the oak leaf, the Annabelle, smooth hydrangeas, the paniculatas, all three of those are very rapid growers, easy to establish. So I would not rule out mail order. And you can find a lot of these online at a lot of nurseries, garden centers. It may be a little more expensive. And of course, you're not supporting a local business, but they're out there, they're available. It's just, if you're looking for a specific variety, that may be the challenge. And even we have that challenge with some of the newer varieties, is finding them.
All right, on a macrophylla, why are the leaves turning brown and crunchy? Too much sun?
Great question. So unfortunately with the macrophylla types, if they do get in too much sun and along the dry side, the edges will scorch, turn brown. Also, that species is susceptible to a hydrangea leaf spot. In the wet, rainy weather, you'll get like little brown, I don't know, pinhead size, circular lesion spots all over the leaves. And that's a secondary leaf spot. But if they're turning brown, my hunch is either a little too hot, like I said, ideally morning sun, afternoon shade, and then watch your watering a little bit more on them.
All right. Someone has a, and I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly, Dennis. Tardiva, there we go. From over 10 years ago that they've planted and left alone. It has gotten to be very airy and about 15 feet tall.
Yep.
It's mostly in the shade in the side yard between houses and seems happy. Should they do anything with it? They can't reach it at its tallest point.
So for those that know me, know that I'm a pretty daring pruner. If you like it that big and it looks good, leave it alone. If you want to go in there in late March, early April and cut that entire plant back to a foot and rejuvenate it, it will come back strong. So to me, it's all about what you want that plant to do as far as size, habit, those type of things. So that plant, I think, is so robust, so established. Even if you cut it back to a foot, 18 inches, it'd probably still in one season be back 6, 7 feet tall before it bloomed.
All right. So we have someone that planted a oak leaf Sykes dwarf in May. It has not bloomed and some leaves are red. Is this typical for these not to bloom the first year?
Yeah, so it's a brand new plant planted in May. It could be that it just wasn't quite vigorous enough yet from the production standpoint to have flowers on it. So give it another year to hopefully set flower buds. Developing some of the fall color early tells me that plant's under a little bit of stress, because stress plants will sometimes develop fall color early. So, you know, not for sure where you're at in the state. So watch the moisture, keep it evenly moist. Oak leaves don't really like wet feet, so be cautious of overwatering. So water thoroughly, less often. And it could just be that you're on a limited root system, being in that container, and that plant's stressing. So if the buds, the vascular system looks healthy, I just keep an eye on it and just keep providing good culture, good care, and hopefully get blooms in 2021.
All right. And then we have one, they want to know where the demo gardens are and if they can come out with samples to find out what they have.
Well, you know, if you're in the Kansas City, Johnson County area, our demonstration garden I keep referring to is at our office building. We're basic at 119th in Ridgeview in Northwest Olathe. Fairly convenient off of K10 and I-35 here in Eastern Kansas. And it's open, it's just out there by our building. So basically during sunrise, you know, when the sun's up, you're welcome to come visit, walk through the garden itself. If you want to, you know, get a more of a tour, more question answered, then you'll probably need to contact me directly, and we can schedule a time to help identify plants with you and take you through the garden. That demonstration garden I talk about has about 400 different species of small shrubs and a few trees in it. It's one of our Extension Master Gardener gardens that we bill as kind of a demonstration for home landscape plant material. So there's a number of different varieties out there.
Okay, what is the best kind of fertilizer to use? And then some also I know to also help with any blooms.
So, you know, this is going to maybe shock some gardeners, but with blooms, you really need to push the nitrogen, that first number, because you're growing a big vegetative shrub, and it takes the nitrogen to push that growth. So I'm not a big fan of like the 5-10 5s or the 10-20 10s, you know, more of a balanced 10-10-10 or even a high nitrogen like a 25-5, something along those lines. And, you know, I hate to give recommendations because it depends on the analysis of the fertilizer. But if you had a 10-10-10 on a well-matured plant, you know, in the spring months, maybe half a cup to a cup of fertilizer sprinkled around that plant and watered in thoroughly. If you're doing higher nitrogen, you might cut that recommendation in half. We don't fertilize our hydrangeas in our demonstration garden. You know, we do a great job mulching. We feel that gives us some nutrients, and they tend to do quite nice. So fertilizer doesn't make a sick plant healthy, just kind of that FYI. It just helps a plant grow stronger and bigger if it is healthy.
Okay, let's see. Deadheading, do you recommend how to go about it? We've had,
you know, we don't deadhead because I think the spent blossoms are another attracting part of the plant. Even like I said, a lot of like the arborescens, like the Annabelle types, it goes chartreuse green after it's white. My Invincible Spirit, it kind of does turn a rusty color after it's done blooming, but I think that provides more interest. So personally, in our Master Gardeners, we don't deadhead those hydrangeas until we prune the following year. So we leave those spent blossoms out there all summer, all fall, all winter. I think that's a personal opinion. Personally, I like to take my spent Annabelle blooms, and this is a little off subject, but I'll cut those suckers down around Thanksgiving, a few of them. I'll spray paint them, red, green, gold, white, yellow, whatever, and I'll put them in my winter decor pots and recycle them that way for holiday decorations. Free.
all right. someone has planted a macrophylla in a large pot. What can they do to keep the roots alive over the winter?
Great question. You know, a lot of people that love the macrophylla hydrangeas, they want blue, they do treat them as container pots. And so once you get a couple light freezes on them, you know, down in the mid 20s, you withhold watering, you bring that pot into your garage, you overwinter it in your garage. And then once that really hard winter conditions are past, so maybe March or so, depending on where you're at in Kansas, you bring that plant back outside to start the growth period over. And that way you protect not only the root system from the winter conditions, but you also protect those flower buds from those extremes. And actually, it's a fun way to do it.
All right, someone has an endless summer that has multiple blooms, but the blooms are near the bottom and difficult to see. Any suggestions on getting more visible blooms?
So that is a result of that winter kill. So basically those blooms, though, that growth closer to the base was probably insulated by the warmth of the soil or a snow cover, and they survived the winter. And so the ones that were going more straight up didn't survive the winter. And so that's why you're seeing those blooms around the base. And I don't really have an answer for that unless you want to go out there in the fall and put like a chicken wire cage around that entire plant, fill it with leaves or straw, and try to protect the plant that way. That is a fairly common problem. You get those spring blooms close to the ground. Then the late summer fall blooms tend to be more on the top of the plant.
All right, there are many more questions, but I think we have reached the end of time. So we'll turn things back over to Krista. We'll try to get these answered and resources out to everyone.
Thank you, Dennis and Travis. Once again, thank you for joining our K-State Garden Hour series. This is going to conclude today's presentation that has been hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We're glad that you joined us to learn about hydrangeas. Make sure you check out the remaining webinars that are going to be coming up. Visit our website for the topics. Again, this session is recorded and will be posted tomorrow afternoon. You should also receive an email with an evaluation survey, and we certainly ask that you take the time to fill that out. That would be very much appreciated. If you have some questions, you can reach out to us by email, ksuemg@ksu.edu. Thanks again, and that concludes our presentation today.